January 14th, 2026. 12 a.m., Strait of Hormuz. The sea should have been alive. Tankers moving in slow, deliberate lines, engines humming, radios crackling with routine chatter in a dozen languages. Instead, there was silence. Captain Elias Rahman stood on the bridge of the MT Andromeda, binoculars pressed tight against his face. The horizon was wrong. No traffic lanes, no movement, just empty water stretching into a pale, hazy dawn. Then he saw it. Low silhouettes, cutting across the surface. Fast. Too fast. Contact bearing 085, he muttered. The radar operator froze. Multiple returns, small craft, closing. Within seconds, the stillness shattered. Speedboats, sleek, narrow, painted in dull naval gray, burst through the morning haze. Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, IRGCN. Their engines screamed as they fanned out, carving arcs through the water like predators circling prey. One of them fired a flare. Bright, violent, impossible to ignore. The message was clear. Stop. 2 weeks earlier, no one had taken it seriously. Not in Washington, not in Tel Aviv, not in Riyadh. Iran had issued warnings again. Brigadier General Alireza Tangsiri, commander of the IRGC Navy, stood before cameras in Bandar Abbas and spoke calmly, almost casually. If our oil cannot pass, no one's oil will pass. It sounded like rhetoric. The same threat repeated for decades. Analysts labeled it predictable, contained, a bluff designed for leverage. Markets dipped for a day, then recovered. Shipping companies adjusted routes on paper, but kept moving. Because the Strait of Hormuz wasn't just water, it was the artery of the world. Nearly a fifth of global oil passed through that narrow corridor, barely 33 kilometers wide at its tightest point. There was no real alternative, no easy detour. Closing it wasn't just escalation, it was economic war, and no one believed Iran would actually pull the trigger. Back on the Andromeda, Captain Rahman lowered his binoculars slowly. "They're signaling us to cut engines," the first officer whispered. Rahman didn't answer, because now he could see more. Not just boats, buoys, small, dark, drifting where they shouldn't be. Mines. "Full stop," Rahman said quietly. Too late. Somewhere behind them, a dull underwater thud rolled through the hull of another tanker. Not an explosion, yet. Just the sound of contact, of something brushing against steel that shouldn't have been there. The radio erupted. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Gulf Star. We have possible mine contact." Static, then silence again, 6:03 a.m. In Bahrain, inside the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters, the screens lit up all at once. Rear Admiral Daniel Whitaker didn't need a briefing. He could see it unfolding in real time. Shipping lanes emptying, civilian distress signals spiking, unidentified small craft multiplying across the grid. "Confirm this," he snapped. A junior officer hesitated. "Sir, we are detecting mine signatures, multiple fields, and coastal missile radars are active." Whitaker leaned closer to the screen. Coastal radar. That meant something else, something far worse. Along Iran's southern coastline, hidden in hardened bunkers and camouflaged launch sites, anti-ship missile batteries were coming online. No announcements, no warnings. Operators moved with rehearsed precision. Targeting systems locked onto coordinates already mapped months in advance. Shipping lanes, chokepoints, naval corridors. Missiles like the Noor and Qadr sat ready on their launch rails, angled toward the narrowest parts of the strait. They didn't need to fire. Not yet. Just being there changed everything. Back at sea, the IRGC boats tightened their perimeter. One of them pulled dangerously close to the Andromeda's port side. A gunner stood behind a mounted DHK heavy machine gun, his face unreadable beneath a helmet and goggles. No shouting, no chaos, just control. Calculated, deliberate control. Captain Rahman felt it then. This wasn't harassment. This wasn't posturing. This was execution. 7:40 a.m., global oil markets opened, and within minutes, they broke. Prices didn't rise gradually. They surged. Traders scrambled as reports flooded in, unconfirmed at first, then undeniable. Strait of Hormuz, blocked. Shipping halted. Possible mining confirmed. CNN cut to live coverage. So did Al Jazeera. Bloomberg terminals flashed red across every trading floor from London to Singapore. "Is this real?" one analyst whispered on air. No one answered, because no one had prepared for this moment to actually happen. In Washington, the Situation Room filled in under 10 minutes. Secretary of Defense Elaine Porter stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, eyes locked on the live feed. "Tell me this isn't a closure," she said. No one spoke. Finally, a voice from the Joint Chiefs. "Ma'am, this is not a warning." A pause. Then quietly, they've already done it. Out in the strait, the sun climbed higher, and still nothing moved. Dozens of tankers drifted in place, engines idling or cut entirely. Crews stood on decks, staring out at a sea that had transformed overnight from a highway into a trap. Above them, a helicopter appeared, low, distant, watching. Below them, invisible threats waited: mines, missiles, and a navy that had decided the line had already been crossed. By noon, it was undeniable. The Strait of Hormuz, the most critical choke point on Earth, was closed, not threatened, not contested, closed. And the world was only just beginning to understand what that really meant. Because shutting it down was one thing. Keeping it closed, that would be something else entirely. Somewhere along Iran's coast, a missile crew received new coordinates. Not defensive, not deterrent, offensive, and far out at sea, a U.S. warship had just changed course. Fast. Too fast for comfort. 087 a.m., U.S. Navy destroyer USS Mason, Northern Gulf, 60 nautical miles from the strait. The course change came without debate. Helm, come to 090. Flank speed. The deck tilted slightly as the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer surged forward, its turbines whining as they pushed toward the choke point. On the bridge, Commander Jason Holt stared ahead, jaw tight. "Any emissions?" he asked. "Negative radar lock so far," the tactical officer replied. "But coastal systems are active. They're watching us." Holt nodded once. Of course they were. They wanted them to come. Inside the Combat Information Center, the lighting was dim, screens glowing in sharp greens and blues. Every contact mattered now. Every blip on the radar carried weight. Multiple fast movers still swarming commercial vessels, a sensor operator called out. "Any missile tracking radars painting us?" A pause. Then, intermittent spikes. Could be fire control systems cycling. Not locked, not yet, but close enough to feel. Thousands of miles away, in London, traders didn't care about radar signatures. They cared about numbers. And the numbers were spiraling. Brent crude surged past $140 a barrel in under an hour, then 150s, then higher. Phones rang nonstop on the trading floor, shouted orders overlapped into chaos. "Sell everything." "No, wait, hold, wait." A senior analyst slammed his hand against the desk. "This isn't a spike, this is a choke." He looked up at the screens, live feeds of empty shipping lanes, tankers stalled in open water. They've cut the artery. In Tehran, the tone was entirely different, controlled, measured. State television broadcast images of IRGC naval units in formation, flags snapping in the wind. No mention of closure, no admission of escalation. Just one phrase repeated over and over: security operation. Behind the scenes, however, the coordination was anything but symbolic. At Bandar Abbas Naval Command, Brigadier General Alireza Tangsiri stood over a digital map of the strait. Red zones marked mine deployments, blue lines showed intercepted shipping routes. An officer stepped forward. All sectors reporting compliance, no unauthorized passage. Tangsiri didn't smile. He simply asked, "And the Americans?" "Moving." A beat then? Good. Back at sea, the USS Mason wasn't alone anymore. Radar picked up additional signatures. Friendly. A British Type 45 destroyer. A French frigate. Coalition ships converging, drawn by the same realization. This wasn't a standoff. It was a blockade. "Sir," the operations officer said quietly, "if we push through, we're entering a mined corridor with active missile coverage." Holt didn't look away from the horizon. "I know." Another pause. "Do we have clearance?" That was the question. Not can they. Should they? In Washington, the answer was still forming. AM, the Situation Room. Satellite imagery filled the main screen, grainy but unmistakable. Iranian fast attack craft, mine-laying patterns, coastal missile sites lighting up like a web along the shoreline. Secretary Porter leaned forward. "How long until the strait is completely unusable?" A naval advisor didn't hesitate. "It already is." Silence. Then another voice. "Any attempt to force entry without clearing operations would risk catastrophic loss." That word hung in the air. Catastrophic. Meanwhile, on the water, the consequences were already unfolding. A Panamanian-flagged tanker, Silver Dawn, drifted too far off its halted position. Just a few hundred meters. Just enough. The explosion wasn't cinematic. It was abrupt, a violent jolt beneath the hull, a column of water erupting upward, followed by a low, crushing sound as steel bent inward. No fireball, no dramatic collapse, just damage and panic. "Mayday, mayday, we've struck!" The transmission cut mid-sentence. Nearby vessels pulled back instinctively, engines reversing, crews shouting across decks. The message spread instantly. The mines were real. On the USS Mason, the report came through seconds later. Confirmed detonation, civilian vessel, likely mine strike. Commander Holt exhaled slowly. That was it, the moment, the line between theory and reality. They've committed, he said under his breath. In Riyadh, emergency meetings mirrored those in Washington. Saudi officials watched the same feeds, but their concern was more immediate. Exports, revenue, stability. This cannot hold, one minister insisted. They cannot maintain this. But no one in the room could say how it would be broken. Not quickly, not cleanly. Back in Tehran, Tangsiri received the same update. Mine detonation, civilian vessel, he nodded once. Good, now they believe. Because that was always the hardest part. Not deploying the weapons, not positioning the forces, but forcing the world to accept that you were willing to use them. 10:26 a.m. The coalition ship slowed, not stopped, but slowed. Careful now, measured, because every mile closer to the strait increased the risk. Every second increased the tension. And somewhere along the Iranian coast, missile crews were no longer just tracking, they were locking. Inside the USS Mason's CIC, a warning tone cut through the room. Sharp, immediate, missile guidance radar spike, bearing 035. Every head snapped toward the screen. Are we painted? A second of silence. Then, negative lock, but it's close. Too close. Commander Holt closed his eyes for half a second. This was the edge. Push forward and risk the first shot. Hold back and accept the closure. There was no neutral ground anymore. Not here. Not now. Out in the strait, the sun was fully up, and still, nothing moved. Except the boats, the mines, and the slow, deliberate tightening of a noose that the world had once called impossible. Because in less than 6 hours, a threat had become reality. And in less than 48, it would become something far more dangerous, permanent. Far to the north, a U.S. aircraft carrier group received new orders, not to observe, not to deter, but to prepare. And along Iran's coastline, missile crews were given final authorization codes. 14:02 p.m. aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, Northern Arabian Sea. The air inside the carrier's command center felt heavier than the ocean outside. Rear Admiral Scott Ramirez stood over a glowing operations table, his fingers pressed against its edge, eyes locked on a live satellite overlay of the strait. Red zones everywhere. Mines, fast attack clusters, missile arcs stretching like invisible tripwires across the water. They didn't just block it, Ramirez said quietly. They built a kill zone. No one disagreed. Outside on the flight deck, the rhythm had changed. FA-18 Super Hornets sat armed, not staged for show, but loaded. Live ordnance, real missions. Deck crews moved faster than usual, but with less noise. No shouting, just gestures, signals. Urgency contained inside discipline, because everyone understood what this meant. If those jets launched, this wouldn't be a standoff anymore. Back inside, the briefing continued. Coalition assets are holding outside effective missile range, an intelligence officer reported. Mine-clearing operations cannot begin under current threat conditions. Ramirez looked up. So we can't clear the mines because of the missiles. Yes, sir. And we can't neutralize the missiles without escalating. A pause. Yes, sir. That was the trap. Perfectly constructed. Across the region, the consequences were accelerating. By late afternoon, over 40 tankers had either halted or rerouted. Insurance rates for transit through the Gulf spiked beyond viability. Some companies issued immediate suspension orders. No ships in, no ships out. Global supply chains didn't just strain, they stalled. In Frankfurt, a refinery executive stared at a projected supply chart. This is 3 days, he said, pointing. After that, we start cutting output. In Tokyo, emergency reserves were quietly unlocked. In India, government officials debated rationing scenarios behind closed doors. The strait wasn't just closed, it was choking the world. But at sea, the pressure was more immediate. 16:05 p.m. USS Mason, now 25 nautical miles from the strait. The warning came fast. Multiple radar locks. Coastal batteries confirmed. The room snapped into motion. Confirmed type. Likely Nor-class anti-ship systems. Range within engagement envelope. Commander Holt's voice stayed steady. Do they have firing solution? A heartbeat. Then, unclear, but they're tracking us actively. Which meant one thing. They were ready. On the Iranian coast, inside a reinforced bunker carved into rock, a missile officer adjusted his headset. Target acquired, he said calmly. Coordinates stable, tracking steady. Through a narrow slit in the hillside, the launcher angled slightly. A Noor anti-ship missile, Chinese-designed, Iranian-modified, sat poised. Range sufficient. Lock nearly complete. He waited, not for permission, for confirmation. Back on the Mason, tension hit a breaking point. Sir, we're being painted continuously now. Holt nodded once. Bring us to defensive posture. Aegis active. The ship responded instantly. Radar arrays shifted. Systems came alive. Vertical launch cells stood ready, standard missiles primed to intercept anything incoming. The Mason wasn't helpless, but neither was the threat. Thousands of miles away, Washington reached its decision, 7 p.m. Secretary Porter stood, hands pressed flat against the Situation Room table. We cannot allow a permanent closure. No one challenged her, because by now the cost was clear. Economic collapse, strategic vulnerability, global instability. The strait had to be reopened. But how? That was the question no one had answered yet. Back at sea, the answer was beginning to form. On the Gerald R. Ford, Admiral Ramirez received the order. Short, direct, prepare limited strike options, not a declaration of war, not an invasion, but something just as dangerous, a first move. He looked up at the operations team. Targets? The intelligence officer didn't hesitate. Coastal radar installations, missile batteries, fast attack concentrations. Ramirez nodded slowly. Keep it contained, he said, then quieter, if that's still possible. On the flight deck, the signal was given. Engines roared to life. One by one, Super Hornets rolled forward, their afterburners igniting in bursts of heat and light. Pilots sat rigid in their cockpits, faces hidden behind reflective visors. They weren't thinking about oil markets or geopolitics, just coordinates, targets, and the thin line between deterrence and war. As the first jet launched, it disappeared into the sky in seconds. Gone. Committed. On the Iranian coastline, radar operators saw it instantly. New contacts. Fast. High altitude. Incoming aircraft, someone called out. The missile officer tightened his grip on the console. This was it. No more waiting. No more signaling. Back on the USS Mason, the radar lit up again. But this time, it wasn't just tracking. Sir, multiple launch signatures detected from shore. Holt didn't hesitate. Intercept. Above the Gulf, the sky changed. Invisible lines crossed. Signals locked. Missiles left their rails. And for the first time since the strait had gone silent, someone fired. What happened next would decide everything, not just the fate of the strait, but whether this crisis would stay contained or ignite something far bigger. Because once the first missile is in the air, there's no going back. 17 p.m. above the Persian Gulf. You wouldn't see it at first. No explosion, no flash, just a streak, thin, fast, almost invisible, cutting upward from the Iranian coastline. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the sky filled with them. Anti-ship missiles, launched in staggered intervals, climbing just high enough before dipping low, hugging the surface, skimming the curvature of the sea. Designed to be unseen until it was too late. Inside the USS Mason's Combat Information Center, the alarms hit all at once. Multiple inbound, bearing 030 to 050. How many? 12 contacts. Correction, 16. Commander Holt's voice cut through the noise. Engage all threats. Full defensive fire. The ship came alive. Aegis combat system locked on. Fire control solutions calculated in fractions of a second. Then, SM-2s away. Vertical launch cells erupted. Missiles shot upward in rapid succession. White plumes tearing into the darkening sky. Interceptors racing to meet incoming death. High above, the first intercept happened almost silently. A flash, a burst, one target gone, then another and another, but not all. Because saturation was the plan. Always the plan. On the Gerald R. Ford, pilots inbound to their targets heard the calls over secure comms. Be advised, multiple launches confirmed, fleet under active engagement. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Alex Rise, tightened his grip on the stick. Copy that, he said. His HUD flickered with updated threat zones. The mission hadn't changed, but everything else had. Back on the Iranian coast, missile crews moved quickly. Reloads, repositioning, secondary launch sites activating. This wasn't a single volley. It was a sequence, wave after wave designed to overwhelm, confuse, and break the rhythm of defense. Next battery ready, an officer reported. Hold, came the reply. Timing mattered. Too early, and the defense adapts. Too late, and the opportunity fades. They would strike again, at exactly the right moment. At sea, the Mason braced. 5 targets still inbound. Close range, engage Cyvus. The phalanx system roared to life. A high-pitched mechanical scream as the Gatling gun spun, thousands of rounds per minute tearing into the air. Tracers stitched the sky. One missile vanished in a burst of fragments. Another slipped through. Impact in. The sentence never finished. A violent shockwave slammed into the ship's port side. Not a direct hit, a near miss. Close enough to send a wall of water crashing across the deck, close enough to rattle every bulkhead and throw men off their feet. Lights flickered. For half a second, everything went dark. Then, emergency systems kicked in. Report. Minor damage, external sensors degraded, no hull breach. Holt steadied himself against the console. They were still alive. Barely. Across the water, coalition ships were faring no better. The British destroyer HMS Diamond reported one confirmed intercept failure. Missiles splashed down within lethal proximity. A French frigate diverted hard, deploying decoys as another missile lost lock at the last second. It wasn't clean. It wasn't controlled. It was chaos, barely contained. Above it all, the U.S. strike aircraft pressed forward. 2 minutes to target, Reyes called out. Below him, the coastline sharpened into view. Radar sites, hardened bunkers, mobile launchers, all active, all dangerous. Fox 3. His missile dropped cleanly, engine igniting a second later as it surged toward a coastal radar installation. Another jet followed, and another. Precision strikes, fast, deliberate. On the ground, Iranian air defense reacted instantly. Surface-to-air missiles launched upwards, streaking toward the incoming jets. Explosions bloomed in the sky. Close, too close. Missile evasion, Reyes snapped, pulling hard as his aircraft banked violently, countermeasures flaring behind him. Heat signatures scattered, lock broken. For now, back at sea, the first wave had ended. Silence returned, but it was different now, heavier, charged. Commander Holt looked at the damage reports scrolling across his screen. They had held, but just barely. Then the warning tone returned, sharper this time. New launch signatures detected. Holt didn't react immediately, because he understood now this wasn't escalation. This was a system, a rhythm of pressure designed to wear them down, wave after wave, until something broke. On the Iranian coast, the second volley ignited. More missiles, more targets, more chaos. In Washington, the Situation Room watched it unfold in real time. No commentary, no analysis, just raw feeds of ships under fire and jets dodging incoming threats. Secretary Porter spoke quietly. This is no longer a containment scenario. No one disagreed. Out in the strait, the illusion had shattered completely. No more warnings, no more signaling. This was war. Limited for now, but real. And as the second wave of missiles raced low across the water, something else moved beneath the surface. Unseen, untracked, closing in. Because missiles weren't the only weapon Iran had prepared, and the next phase would be even harder to stop. 18:03 p.m., Strait of Hormuz, beneath the surface. No alarms, no radar, no warning tones echoing through steel corridors. Just water, cold, cold, dark, silent, and moving through it, something no one could see. On board the USS Mason, the crew was still recovering from the second missile wave. Damage control teams moved fast, checking compartments, recalibrating sensors, restoring degraded systems. External arrays at 60%, one technician reported. Good enough, Holt replied, because it had to be. There was no stepping back now. Sonar status? A pause. Then, passive systems online, active ping limited due to interference. Interference, not natural, deliberate. Beneath the surface, Iranian naval units had deployed more than just mines. Small, fast, and nearly silent, Ghadir-class mini-submarines moved slowly through the narrow waters of the strait, designed for exactly this environment. Shallow, crowded, confined, perfect. Inside one of them, the air was thick with heat and tension. A young officer leaned forward, eyes locked on a dim sonar display. Target bearing, stable, he whispered. Not a warship, not yet. A tanker, disabled, drifting, easy. Above, the Silver Dawn still struggled. Crew members worked frantically to assess damage, unaware of what was approaching beneath them. Because you don't hear a mini-submarine, you don't see it, you only feel the result. On the Iranian coast, command units tracked everything. Surface, air, subsurface. The operation wasn't chaotic, it was layered. Mines to halt, missiles to deter, subs to finish. Back on the Mason, something shifted. Sonar contact, a technician said suddenly. The room stilled. Type? Unclear, small, intermittent signature. Holt turned slowly. Range? Close, too close. Active ping, Holt ordered. A sharp pulse echoed into the depths. For a brief moment, the ocean revealed its secret. A faint shape, low profile, compact, moving. Subsurface contact confirmed. Track it. But even as they tried, it vanished again, because that was the design. Appear, disappear, strike when unseen. Moments later, another explosion, this one different, deeper, heavier. Not a mine, a torpedo. The Silver Dawn didn't stand a chance. The blast tore through its lower hull, sending a violent shudder up through the deck. Metal screamed. Water rushed in. This time, there was no confusion, no uncertainty. The ship was lost. "Mayday, this is Silver." Gone. On the Mason, silence followed the report. Then confirmed torpedo strike. Holt closed his eyes for half a second. Now it had changed again. This wasn't just denial of passage, this was active destruction. "Rules of engagement?" the operations officer asked. The question hung heavy, because engaging surface missiles was one thing. Hunting submarines, that was escalation on another level. In Washington, the update hit hard. Torpedo confirmed, civilian vessel lost. Secretary Porter didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood. Iran hadn't just closed the strait, they were enforcing it. Back at sea, the tension deepened. Coalition ships adjusted formation, spreading out, activating anti-submarine protocols. Helicopters launched, MH-60 Seahawks dipping sonar arrays into the water, searching, listening, hunting. But the strait wasn't open ocean. It was tight, cluttered, noisy, a nightmare for detection. Inside the Gadir sub, the young officer exhaled slowly. Target neutralized. No celebration, just acknowledgement. Then, next coordinates received. Above him, warships scanned blindly. Below him had already begun again. 19:11 p.m. The third missile wave hadn't come yet, but something worse had replaced it, uncertainty. Because now the threat wasn't just what you could see on radar, it was what you couldn't. Commander Holt stood on the bridge now, looking out over darkening water. The horizon flickered with distant fires, burning debris from damaged vessels. The strait had become something else entirely, not a passage, a battlefield. "Sir," a voice came over comms, "we are receiving new orders from command." Holt turned. "Send it." A pause. Then begin coordinated strike expansion. All hostile naval assets authorized. There it was. The shift. From response to retaliation. Far above, more aircraft were already in the air. Far below, more submarines were already moving. And along the Iranian coastline, new missile crews stepped into position. Because the first day wasn't over yet. And already, it had gone further than anyone had imagined. But the real question was no longer whether the strait could be reopened. It was how far both sides were willing to go, to take it back. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, another contact appeared. Closer, faster, and this time, it wasn't a submarine. 22 p.m., Strait of Hormuz, nightfall. Darkness didn't bring calm. It made everything worse. The sea disappeared into black glass, broken only by scattered lights, burning wreckage, drifting tankers, the cold beams of naval searchlights cutting across the water. And then, fast movers inbound. On the USS Mason, the radar painted them clearly this time. Not missiles, not subs, surface contacts, multiple, speed, high, direction straight toward the coalition line. Commander Holt didn't need confirmation. IRGC fast attack craft, he said. The same boats from the morning. But this time, they weren't signaling. They were charging. Through night vision optics, they appeared like ghosts. Low silhouettes bouncing across the water. Engines screaming, wakes glowing faintly under infrared. Each one armed, each one committed. Range? Closing fast, 10 nautical miles. Holt's voice stayed level. Warn them. A radio transmission cut through the night in multiple languages. Unidentified vessels, you are approaching a coalition naval formation. Alter course immediately or you will be engaged. No response. They kept coming. On one of the Iranian boats, a young commander gripped the wheel, eyes fixed forward. Ahead, American warships, massive, silent, waiting. Behind him, orders. No hesitation. Back on the Mason. 5 miles. Still no change in course. Holt gave the order. Fire warning shots. A burst of tracer rounds streaked across the water, splashing ahead of the lead boat. For a moment, it looked like they might slow. They didn't. 3 miles. Now it was no longer a warning. It was a decision. Holt didn't raise his voice. Engage. The night exploded. Machine guns opened first, controlled bursts tearing across the water. Then heavier weapons. A 25mm chain gun thundered, rounds slamming into the lead boat. It didn't stop immediately. It kept coming until it didn't. A sudden flash, then nothing. But the others didn't break. They split, fanning out, flanking. This wasn't reckless. It was tactical. Multiple vectors, the radar operator shouted. They're trying to surround. On the British destroyer nearby, weapons lit up in response. Tracers crossed in intersecting lines, turning the dark sea into a web of fire. One boat veered hard, dodging. Another didn't. Impact. Explosion. Fragments scattering across the water. But still, more kept coming. Inside one of the surviving IRGC boats, a crewman lifted a launcher. Short-range, portable, deadly. He fired. Missile launch. Close range. The warning came too late. A small anti-ship rocket streaked across the water, slamming into the side of a coalition support vessel. A sharp explosion. Not catastrophic, but enough. Enough to prove something. This wasn't just harassment. This was commitment. Back on the Mason, Holt watched the engagement unfold through night optics. Keep distance. Don't let them close. Because that was the danger. Not their size. Not their armor. Their proximity. Too close. And even a small weapon becomes lethal. Within minutes, it was over. The remaining boats broke off, retreating into the darkness they came from. Fast. Gone. Silence returned, but it was different now, heavier, darker, because something had just changed. Damage report, Holt said. Minor. One coalition vessel hit, no critical losses. He nodded slowly. A tactical success, but strategically, something else, because the line had moved again, from missiles to torpedoes to direct surface combat, step by step, closer, more dangerous. 21:18 p.m. On the Gerald R. Ford, Admiral Ramirez stood alone for a moment, looking out over the dark ocean. Reports kept coming in. Engagements, losses, escalations, all within hours. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. This is accelerating. Behind him, an officer approached. Sir, new intelligence update. Ramirez turned. Go. Additional missile batteries are mobilizing further inland, range extended, capable of targeting deeper into the Gulf. Ramirez's expression didn't change, but his eyes did, because that meant something very specific. The battlefield was expanding. Back in Tehran, leadership reviewed the same data. No panic, no urgency, just calculation. Each move measured, each escalation deliberate. The objective hadn't changed. Hold the strait, control the narrative, force the world to react, and it was working. By midnight, the reality was undeniable. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer just closed. It was contested, actively, violently, continuously. But the most dangerous part was still ahead, because so far, both sides had held something back. Just enough, just below the threshold. That restraint was about to be tested. Far above the Gulf, new aircraft entered the region. Not strike fighters, not surveillance, something heavier. And deep inside command channels, a word began to appear. Quietly, reluctantly. Escalation. January 15th, 2026. 47 a.m., northern Persian Gulf. The sky changed first. A low, distant rumble, different from jets, deeper, heavier, rolled across the darkness. On radar, the signatures appeared slowly, large, high altitude, steady. Sir, new contacts entering the grid, an operator reported aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford. Admiral Ramirez didn't need the identification. Bombers, he said quietly. They had been held back until now. A line not crossed, a signal not sent. Until this moment, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, launched hours earlier from distant bases, slipped into the operational theater, nearly invisible to conventional radar. Their mission wasn't symbolic. It was surgical, deep strike capability, the kind that doesn't just disrupt, it removes. Inside one of the bombers, the cockpit was silent except for the hum of systems. Coordinates confirmed, targets locked, time on target, synchronized. No visual confirmation needed, no warning given. Back on the Iranian coastline, radar operators noticed something strange. Intermittent anomalies, flickers, signals that didn't stay long enough to track. Possible interference, one technician suggested. Another shook his head. No, something else. It was already too late. Though 58 a.m., the first strike hit, not along the water, but inland. A hardened missile coordination facility, buried beneath layers of reinforced concrete, vanished in a controlled, precise detonation. No massive fireball, just a sudden collapse, then silence. Seconds later, another. A mobile missile battery, moments after repositioning, was struck before it could deploy. Gone. On the coast, confusion spread. Comms lost in Sector 3, radar offline in Sector 5. Reports flooded in faster than they could be processed. This wasn't the chaotic exchange of earlier. This was targeted, calculated, unavoidable. On the USS Mason, The change was immediate. Missile radar emissions dropping, the tactical officer said. Holt looked up. Confirmed? Yes, sir. Multiple sites offline. For the first time in hours, the pressure eased, just slightly. But it came at a cost. In Tehran, the reaction was different. This wasn't just defense anymore. This was penetration. Deep, precise, and impossible to ignore. A senior commander slammed his hand on the table. They have crossed the threshold. No debate, no hesitation, because this wasn't a warning strike. This was dismantling. 1 a.m. New orders moved quickly through Iranian command, faster than before, less measured. Back at sea, Admiral Ramirez received the update. Primary targets neutralized, missile coverage degraded. He nodded. Begin planning for mine-clearing operations. Finally, the first step toward reopening the strait. But even as he said it, something didn't feel right, because Iran hadn't overreacted yet, not fully. Then the alert came, sudden, urgent. Ballistic launch detected. The room froze. Source? Inland, deep territory, not coastal. Ramirez turned slowly. Ballistic. That changed everything. Moments later, confirmation. Trajectory, not toward ships. A pause. Then heading for regional airbase, hundreds of kilometers away, a coalition airbase, used for staging naval support and aircraft operations, lit up with alarms. Incoming ballistic missile. Personnel scrambled, shelters filled, systems activated. But there was no time. Impact. A blinding flash. A shockwave that rippled outward, shaking everything in its path. Fuel depots ignited, runways cracked. Aircraft, caught in the open, were damaged or destroyed in seconds. Back on the Ford, silence fell over the command center. Because this was it, the shift from maritime conflict to regional war. Ramirez exhaled slowly. They responded. In Washington, the Situation Room received the same feed. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to interpret. This was no longer limited, no longer contained. Across the Gulf, every system lit up. Air defenses, naval tracking, satellite feeds. Everything accelerated, and out in the strait, for the first time since the beginning, the ships began to move, slowly, carefully, because the missile coverage had weakened, because the pressure had shifted. But the cost was now undeniable, because in less than 24 hours, the world had gone from watching a blockade to witnessing the opening phase of a much larger war. And the Strait of Hormuz, the center of it all, was no longer just a strategic point. It was the spark. Somewhere in the distance, another launch was detected. Different trajectory, different target, and this time, it wouldn't be contained to the region. 3:20 a.m. Strait of Hormuz. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, something moved forward. A line of ships, slow, careful, deliberate. U.S. Navy mine countermeasure vessels, low profile, specialized, almost fragile compared to destroyers, entered the outer edge of the strait. Wooden hulls, reduced magnetic signatures, built for one purpose, to survive where everything else couldn't. Commence sweep, came the order. Behind them, MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters hovered low over the water, towing sleds designed to trigger or detect mines. Every movement measured, every second tense, because one mistake was enough. On board the lead vessel, sailors stared at sonar screens and surface markers, mapping invisible threats beneath them. Possible contact port side, 40 meters. A pause, then confirmed, mine. They didn't rush. They couldn't. A remotely operated vehicle slipped into the water, guided slowly toward the object. Dark, round, waiting. A relic of old warfare, deployed with modern precision. Back on the USS Mason, Commander Holt watched the operation unfold through live feed. "This is it," he said quietly. "The first real attempt to take the strait back." Behind the sweep vessels, coalition warships formed a protective arc. Missile defenses active, guns ready, helicopters circling. Because everyone knew, Iran would not let this happen uncontested. And they didn't. 03:58 a.m. New radar emissions detected. Multiple coastal sources. Holt's eyes snapped to the screen. Missile systems, partial, degraded, but active. Enough to matter. Enough to threaten everything in that narrow corridor. On the Iranian coastline, surviving missile crews scrambled. Improvised positions, mobile launchers dragged into new angles. Not as strong as before, but still dangerous. "Target mine-clear units," an officer ordered, because they were the key. Not the warships, not the carriers, the small, slow vessels clearing the path. Destroy them, and the strait stays closed. At sea, missile launch detected. The warning cut through the calm. "Intercept!" Aegis systems activated instantly, standard missiles launched, streaking upward. But this time, the geometry was tighter, closer, less room for error. One incoming missile broke through the first layer, then the second. CID was engaged. The phalanx roared again, tracers lighting up the darkness. The missile disintegrated just meters above the waterline. Fragments rained down, too close. But the mine-clearing vessels kept moving. They had to, because stopping meant failure. Second contact neutralized, a technician reported. The underwater charge detonated, a dull, heavy explosion beneath the surface. One less threat. Hundreds to go. Back in Washington, they're attempting clearance, an advisor said. Secretary Porter nodded slowly. And Iran? Still engaging, but less coordinated. Because of the strikes, because of the damage. But not enough. Not yet. Out in the strait, dawn began to break again. Faint light stretched across the horizon, revealing the scale of what had happened. Burning debris, drifting ships, naval formations locked in tense formation. It didn't look like a shipping lane anymore. It looked like a war zone. At 5 a.m., exactly 24 hours since the first closure. And then, something unexpected. Sir, Iranian vessels are pulling back. Holt turned. Confirm. Multiple fast attack craft retreating toward coastal waters. No pursuit. No pressure, just withdrawal. It didn't make sense, not yet. On the Iranian side, command channels shifted, orders changed, focus moved. Away from the strait, towards something else. Back on the Gerald R. Ford, Admiral Ramirez received new intelligence. His expression hardened. Where? The officer swallowed. Multiple launch preparations, long range. Not anti-ship, not coastal, something bigger. Ramirez exhaled slowly. They're widening it. Out in the strait, the mine clearing continued. One path. Narrow, fragile, but real. For the first time since the crisis began, a corridor was forming. Ships began to reposition, carefully, waiting for the signal. The strait wasn't open, not yet. But it was no longer completely closed. And that alone changed everything. Because now the question wasn't whether it could be reopened. It was whether reopening it would trigger something far worse. Far beyond the strait, new targets were being selected, new trajectories calculated. And somewhere, deep inside a command center, a final authorization was being considered. Because once that order was given, there would be no more containment, no more limits, only escalation. January 15th, 2026. 7:40 a.m. Central Command Forward Operations, undisclosed location. The room was quieter than it had been all night. Not calmer, just heavier. Because everyone inside knew what was being discussed, and what it meant. Confirm classification, Secretary Porter said. The intelligence officer hesitated for half a second. Then, medium-range ballistic missiles, multiple launch sites, estimated payload, conventional but high yield. A pause. Targets? Another breath. Regional infrastructure, air bases, ports, possibly energy facilities. Not ships, not the strait, everything around it. Back on the Gerald R. Ford, Admiral Ramirez stood motionless as the update came through. They're shifting the battlefield, he said quietly. Not trying to hold the strait anymore, trying to make reopening it too costly. Outside, the mine-clearing corridor had widened slightly, still narrow, still dangerous, but usable. One tanker had already begun slow movement under escort, careful, vulnerable, a symbol more than a solution. On board that tanker, the crew moved in silence. No one spoke, because every eye was fixed on the horizon and the sky. Because now the threat wasn't just below the surface or skimming across it. It was coming from above. 08:03 a.m. Ballistic launches confirmed. The call echoed across every command channel. Multiple launches, simultaneous, from deep inside Iranian territory. Radar systems lit up, trajectories calculated in real time, arcs stretching across maps toward multiple points in the Gulf. Impact windows, minutes, not hours, minutes. At a coalition airbase in the region, sirens screamed. Personnel ran. Aircraft, those that remained, were scrambled or abandoned. There wasn't enough time. There was never enough time. The first missile hit hard, a blinding flash, then a shockwave that rippled outward, flattening structures and igniting fuel stores. Seconds later, another and another. Runways cracked, hangars collapsed, communications went dark. Back in the command center, no one spoke. They just watched. Because this wasn't symbolic anymore. This was strategic targeting. Damage assessment? Porter asked. Severe, came the reply. Operational capability degraded, possibly offline. That was the goal. Not to destroy everything, just enough. enough to slow the response, enough to raise the cost. Out at sea, the effect was immediate. Coalition air cover, thinner. Support infrastructure, strained. The corridor through the strait suddenly more fragile. Commander Holt watched the updates scroll across his screen. "They're not trying to stop us here," he said. "They're trying to make it impossible everywhere else." And it was working, because now every decision carried more weight. Every move forward risked a wider collapse. In Tehran, the message was clear, delivered not through words, but through impact. If the strait reopened, the war would expand. Back on the Ford, Admiral Ramirez received a new directive, short, blunt, prepare for expanded response options. He read it twice, then looked up, because that phrase meant something very specific. Escalation beyond the region. He turned to his staff. "What are our limits?" No one answered immediately, because the truth was, those limits were already fading. Out in the strait, the tanker moved another mile forward, slow, exposed, alive. Behind it, more ships prepared to follow, because despite everything, the world needed this passage open. But above them, new trajectories were already forming. Longer, wider, more dangerous, because the next phase wouldn't just hit bases or ships, it would test something else entirely, something no one in that room wanted to say out loud. How far this war could go, and whether anyone still had control over it. Somewhere, deep within a command chain, a final question was asked. Not can we respond, but should we, because the next move would not be reversible. January 15th, 2026, 11:03 a.m. Strait of Hormuz. The corridor held, narrow, fragile, barely a line across the water, but real. For the first time since the crisis began, ships were moving through it. Slow convoys, escorted, watched from every direction. Above, coalition aircraft, around, warships in layered formation. Below, uncertainty still lurking in the depths. But it was open, not fully, not safely, but open. On the bridge of the tanker Al-Safa, Captain Nabil Hassan stood motionless as his vessel crossed the invisible boundary where the strait had once been sealed. "Maintain speed," he said quietly. No one responded. They were all watching, waiting for something to happen. Because after everything, it still didn't feel real. Back on the USS Mason, Commander Holt tracked the convoy's movement. "First successful passage confirmed," an officer reported. Holt nodded. A small victory, measured in miles, paid for in far more. But the tension hadn't lifted, not even close. In Washington, the Situation Room remained active. Damage reports still incoming, air bases hit, infrastructure damaged, casualties, numbers not yet finalized. Secretary Porter stood at the same position she had held for hours, arms crossed. Status of escalation? A senior advisor answered carefully, contained for now. For now, because both sides had reached the edge and stopped, just short. Iran had struck hard. Ballistic missiles, naval enforcement, economic disruption on a global scale. The coalition had responded, precision strikes, naval engagement, gradual reopening of the strait. Neither had gone further. Yet, out in the Gulf, the signs of conflict remained everywhere. Damaged vessels drifting, burn marks across decks, debris fields stretching across miles of water. The strait looked open, but it felt scarred. On the Iranian coast, missile sites stood quieter now, not destroyed. Not gone, just waiting. Inside one command bunker, an officer reviewed the latest updates. Strait partially reopened. A pause. Then, global markets stabilizing. He looked up. And our losses? The answer came quietly. Significant but acceptable. Because the objective had never been permanent closure. Not entirely. It was demonstration, capability, control. And that message had been delivered. Back aboard the Gerald R. Ford, Admiral Ramirez stepped out onto the deck. The sea stretched before him, calmer now, almost deceptively so. Behind him, jets were being refueled, systems reset, crews rotated. The machine was still running, still ready. An officer approached. "Sir, updated directive." Ramirez took the document, read it once, then folded it slowly. "No further strikes," he said. A pause. "For now." That phrase again, always attached, always lingering, because nothing had truly ended. In the strait, the second convoy began its movement. More ships, more risk, more necessity. The world watched closely this time. No disbelief, no dismissal, only awareness. Because in just 48 hours, everything had changed. A threat once called a bluff had become reality, and not just for the region, but for the entire world. Oil markets would remember, military planners would remember, governments would remember. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer just a choke point, it was proof. Proof that a single decision, made in a narrow stretch of water, could ripple across the globe. Back on the Al Safa, Captain Hassan finally exhaled as his ship cleared the most dangerous stretch. Behind him, the horizon was still marked by smoke. Ahead, open sea. But even then, he didn't relax, because everyone understood something now, something they hadn't before. The strait wasn't safe, it was never safe. It was only open, and that could change again, fast. Somewhere, far beyond the Gulf, new strategies were already being written, new plans drafted, new thresholds considered. Because the next time, there might not be a pause, there might not be restraint, there might only be escalation, and when that moment comes, the world will remember this one. The day they called it a bluff, and the day they were wrong. And if you've stayed until this final moment, thank you. If you want to keep exploring events like this, deeper, more real, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for watching.